All right, cool. So let's let's go
Yeah.
to that hideous strength then, which I have to thank you both for because I enjoyed that hideous strength, but like I said, it left my heart on Paralandra. It wasn't until I read Deeper Heaven and I listened to your lecture, Doug, that I really got the gravity of that hideous strength, and I understood. So let's start with like what was C.S. Lewis trying to do in that hideous strength that was different from what he was trying to do in the other than what he was doing in the other two books.
Well, the silent planet is our planet, Thulkandra. So the Oyarsa associated with these different planets are unfallen except for ours. So the devil is the fallen Oyarsa of our world in Lewis's construct, and it's the devil has taken over our world. And out of you all like Paralandra the most. I'm my favorite. I love Paralandra, but my favorite novel of all time is That Hideous Strength, because there's so many parts of it where
Yeah,
Lewis is just simply prophetic.
yeah,
He's talking about our world, and he's talking about our world today in 2022, and he was writing about it in the 1940s.
yeah,
And I keep, how could you know that? How could you
yeah.
anticipate that? How could, well, it's because it's not that he understood technology, it's that he understood people. He,
Hmm.
he understood God's word, and he understood how people worked. And, and so that hideous strength basically gives you the vision of enemy occupied territory and the faithful band, a small faithful band of resistance fighters, the company at St. Anne's, is headed up by Ransom, who is not a martial figure in this book. He doesn't do any fighting. He's a director. They call him a director, but he's actually a king. So he's a wounded king who has great authority, but doesn't do any actual fighting. And the conflict in the book is almost entirely spiritual. And when actual violence breaks out, it's conducted by animals in the banquet at Belbury.
And Christiana, maybe you can talk about the characters of Mark and Jane Studdock a little bit. So the story kind of centers around them.
Yeah, so I think the first word of that his strength is matrimony, and that's kind of the theme sets the theme for the rest of the book. I think it's Pastor Wilson. I think you've said before it's almost like a book on marriage counseling, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe I've heard someone say that is that it's I really Mark and Jane are the central characters, which kind of might draw us back a bit at first, seeing as how the first two books were following Ransom in particular, and then in this book, the camera focus is primarily on these other two characters. But the reason for that is I think both of them are supposed to embody the characters of the Oyarsa, the planets that Ransom has already visited. Right, Mark, his very name, makes you think of Mars, and then Jane is meant to be an embodiment of Venus, and they are both abdicating from those roles and rejecting those roles in very different ways, in almost opposite ways. And Ransom, as a jovial figure, as Pastor Wilson already referred to, he's a kingly, wounded king figure, which is very reminiscent of Jove. Jove is the figure that connects. That's one of the primary things that Jove does is he connects things. So he is a bridge. And Ransom in this book bridges ends up bridging and connecting Mark and Jane, bringing them back together. But also, he also serves as a bridge between Deep Heaven and the Silent Planet, working with again the Oyarses from those planets, and then you have the figure of Merlin that comes in. So that just complicates things. Um, but Mark and Jane throughout the book, it's very fascinating because the whole thing flips back and forth between one to the next, which I think is why some people might have struggled with it a little bit because it can be a little bit jarring at times to jump back and forth between those two characters. But primarily, Mark, his problem is he's constantly trying to get in, right? He wants to fit in. He wants to be part of the cool kids club, which Lewis calls the inner circle, right? He wants to be in the know, right? And his fear constantly is of being left out, outside of where, that spot everyone wants to get into, the elite, right? And so he's constantly trying to fit in, kind of doing what's expected of him, trying to climb the ladder and constantly get inside. Whereas Jane she just wants to be left alone, really. She wants to get out. She wants to stand out. And so she has rejected kind of the role that she's called to, which is to be a wife and a mother. She despises her husband. Has rejected childbearing, and she just wants to be left alone in her academic attic to write her thesis on John Donne that no one wants to read anymore. So she has her both of them face a moment of, you could call it conversion, I think, where they have to reject their rebellion, right? Which means for Mark, he has to actually stand firm and rebel, because he's been constantly laying down the whole time and just taking what's coming at him, and he has to stop and say no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to take that step. And Jane has to learn submission, and not just submission, but submission to her own husband, which is perhaps more difficult because she sees what Mark is like, and that's hard for her to do. She at one point is completely ready to submit to Ransom because of who Ransom is, and he rejects that submission, saying, no, that doesn't belong to me, that belongs to your husband. And so that's her moment of when she finally realizes that's where she has to put that submission.
It's a big moment. I wonder if Doug, can we talk a little bit about how it's taking this, that hideous strength, before we move on to Bellbury and St. Anne's, how Lewis is able to take the stories of, say, Greek and Roman mythology, Venus and Mars, right, and Jove, and roll them into a kind of a Christian framework. It seems a bit odd that he would fuse these two things together with this big cosmology, but he actually makes it work quite well. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that for a second.
Yeah, I think the reason Lewis is able to do that is that he understands that he's just simply standing in a long tradition, a long Christian tradition, where Christian theological concepts were communicated routinely throughout the Middle Ages by means of classical tropes and classical gods and goddesses by Christians who didn't believe in the classical gods and goddesses. So Lewis is a specialist in medieval and Renaissance literature. I think he probably read everything that that had ever been written in that era, and he was just simply steeped in it. I think he's simply continuing the tradition. So it's not a C.S. Lewis novelty where he comes along and tries to communicate Christian doctrine by means of these deities. What he does is he understands that, as the Apostle Paul says in Corinthians, there are gods many and there are lords many, but for us there's just one God. So for the ancient Greeks, the gods and goddesses were gods and goddesses. For the Christians, it's not the gods and goddesses were nullities or superstitions, but rather fallen celestial angelic beings that had reality, that could actually do things. So when in Acts 16, when the Apostle Paul cast the demon out of the fortune-telling girl, it says literally in the Greek that he cast out the spirit of a python. And you say, really? Well, what that tells you is that what that tells you is she was a devotee of the god Apollo, because the oracle at Delphi was called the Pythoness, because the story was that Apollo had come down to Delphi and had slain a giant python there. And so this girl who had the spirit of a python is a devotee of Apollo. That's what it's saying. Now, she really could tell fortunes, and Paul really did bankrupt their business. So it wasn't superstition. It's just that the pagans would call them gods, and the Jews, and then later the Christians, would call them demons. So then later in medieval Christianity, the spiritual reality of these gods and goddesses was taken for granted, but they were put into a cosmos where the creator God was over all. And Lewis treats them as angelic beings.
Not as demonic beings.
Right. Well, there's demonic beings down here on the Silent Planet, and angelic ones, unfallen ones in the heavens.
Got it. As the Oyarsa of the various planets.
Right.
So
they have
go ahead.
They have their fallen counterparts on Earth. So we see that in that Hideous Strength when Jane gets a glimpse of what Lewis calls the infernal Venus. So a glimpse of the terrestrial embodiment of that goddess, right? Venus, who we would call Venus, but she's just a terrestrial version of a fallen version of the Oyarsa of Venus, right? Which would be the angelic being, which we see come down in the chapter, The Descent of the Gods.